Hi, guys, and welcome back to our second episode of the Green Dragon podcast. I'm your host, Aiden.
Uh, I'm a fellow host, Tom Tisnick.
And I am your third host, Jake Kosmala.
And so we're back this second week. We had our first podcast last week. Hopefully, you guys have listened to that. If not, you can go back either if you're listening on Spotify, back to our first podcast and get a feeling for who we are, what this podcast is about. We're also on YouTube as well. So if you want to see the video, you can go there and check that out. So starting off this second week, in our first podcast, we discussed the Second Amendment and the rights that we as Americans have and we've been granted through that Second Amendment. And this week, we're going to discuss the First Amendment. So we're really excited to share with you guys a little bit about that. I think that sometimes people forget what the First Amendment is. It's the right to free speech. It contains our rights to the freedom and practice of our religion, as well as our ability to stand up and tell and ask the government to be accountable. So I think all three of those things are extremely important. And so we're really excited to discuss with you guys today a little bit about that. But yeah, before we get rolling with that, I think there was a couple things that popped up in the news this week that I thought we'd discuss. If you didn't listen to the first podcast, we'll start out every podcast with a quick rundown of some current events that are going on that might be applicable to your lives, might be relevant, just to keep you up to date with those things. So to get things started, guys, one thing I saw in the news this week that actually popped up the other day that was a little bit concerning. We talked a little bit about the Second Amendment in our first podcast, which is the right to bear arms. Now, this was an article, actually a YouTube video I had found about a new assault weapons ban. There's been several in the last couple months that Congress has been trying to push through. But this one's a new one. It's Bill HR 88882. So that's 8882. There's too many eights there to say. But it was submitted by Chris Jacobs, who's a Republican senator out of New York. And funny enough, Jacobs has already announced that he won't be running this fall. This is largely due to the fact that Jacobs kind of got the boot by the Republican Party. So it's interesting to see him trying to push this bill right before he's out of office. It's like he's trying to go out with a bang. No pun intended there. But this bill essentially contains several different things in it. Jacobs claims it will be a bill to ensure guns don't fall into the wrong hands while still protecting Americans' ability to preserve and exercise their Second Amendment rights, which is kind of it's kind of contradicting there, because any infringement on the Second Amendment isn't protecting Americans' ability to exercise or preserve their Second Amendment rights. So I think that's a bit silly to claim. But of course, he claims that this is going to fix, all the problems and it's going to make America safer and yada, yada, yada. Another thing he claims is that these common sense, as you'll hear a lot of anti-Second Amendment, anti-gun politicians use, these common sense gun laws will, make a huge difference. And this term common sense is used as an overarching term, typically in reference to laws that really don't apply very well to anybody that understands how the system of applying to purchase a firearm or purchasing a firearm or using a firearm. I mean, they aren't common sense. They're actually quite the opposite. So what's in this bill? He has a mandatory safety course that would be required. Of course, the bill doesn't specify what that course would be, what it would entail, how long it would be, where you could take it. And the big issue with that is availability. So in the Second Amendment, obviously, you're granted the right to bear arms to protect yourself and your country. So if you're then required to take this mandatory safety course, but it takes, a year and a half of training, it kind of defeats the purpose of having the Second Amendment if you've got to go through a year and a half of training just to, get a firearm right. So I think that's pretty silly. I believe it also includes an FBI background check, a universal background check, as they call it. This is another funny one just because we already have a background check when you go to purchase a firearm. If anybody's ever gone to purchase a firearm, you have to run a background check, and that background check is run through local state police. It's based on a criminal and mental health record, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's right, guys. So to say that you have to go through a background check, that's something it's a system that's already in place. So this is just like another way for them. They're calling it an FBI background check. It sounds fancy. It's essentially going to be the same thing. If anything, they'll just dig deeper into your past to find more reasons why you shouldn't have a gun. And that's the biggest thing that's where the infringement is. You'd have to go through fingerprinting, proof of identity. You already have to have proof of identity to buy a firearm, so I don't really understand how that's anything new. But the biggest thing for me that I read is you'd have to have a license if you owned anything that was considered what they're calling an assault weapon, which is a semi-automatic. In this case, it's just a semi-automatic, which means, for those of you who don't know, you have to pull the trigger every time you want to shoot one bullet. So it's not automatic. It doesn't, you don't, contrary to what a lot of these politicians will say, it's not like a Gatling gun out there. You can't just pull the trigger and shoot off like 100 rounds in 2 seconds. So they're classifying, they don't really have a classification for these assault weapons. Assault weapons is this made up term to classify basically, I would say probably 90% of the guns in this country, which is scary to think that they could, with one swift bill being passed, they could, essentially make 90% of our guns either outlawed or extremely hard to use or get. So they are saying that any assault weapons, you'd have to apply for this license that you have to renew every 5 years. Now, what's the biggest problem here? It's a constitutional right. You shouldn't have to have a license for it. So that seems a bit ridiculous to me. And not only that, but it's not like a one-time license where you pass your background check, you pass all these things, and then you're good. No, you've got to come back for it and pay them. And I'm sure this is like one big, like, giant scam to get you to pay the government like $100 every 5 years. And people are like, oh, what's $100? But like, they'll scrape every penny out of you if you're not watching. So you got to be careful there. But yeah, it just seems a bit ridiculous. What I do find kind of hilarious is you'll be able to, there's no license required to shoot any gun at the range if you rent it. So I don't understand, if you're gonna require a license to shoot guns, then why aren't you requiring it at the range if you're renting? I guess it's just for ownership. I mean, I don't really understand. There's some really weird stuff in this bill. As always, they're like, like 500 pages long. They try to throw everything under the sun in there. There's probably something in there about your gas tax, or what you're supposed to do with your second born child. I don't know. I mean, seriously, these bills are absolutely insane. I think it's really hilarious. Another quick like side note, so that's really it for it, but I just wanted to like make everybody aware, because I know people that own guns that don't know this, is AR, when you hear the word AR-15 or AR-10, they're not talking, and every politician probably believes this, especially on one side of the aisle. AR does not stand for assault rifle. It stands for armor light rifle, which was the first. Tom, maybe you could chime in on this, but I believe it was the first company to really have the design for what we now know as the AR-15. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. And another interesting fact about the assault rifle, quote unquote, name,
Mm-hmm.
it's never actually been really given to a gun, as far as I'm aware. It was actually a term that Hitler came up with in World War II, to incite fear into the enemy.
Hmm.
So he said that we need to arm our troops with assault weapons or assault rifles.
Interesting.
So
It,
I don't know if it's ever been actually used as a term with US manufacturing of weapons. Um, I'm not 100% on that. I still need to look into that, but I just thought that was interesting.
that is really interesting, especially when you look at how the term assault rifle is being used right now to incite fear, I would say, into our population. It's almost like they stole it right out of Hitler's playbook. just it's to incite fear into the citizens instead of the enemy. But who knows? Maybe we are their enemy.
Yeah, I do find it comical their proclivity to throw around terms that they cannot even clearly define, such as assault rifle, semi-automatic, common sense gun laws. It's just all it is gaslighting those who hold an opposing viewpoint into conforming to their their line of thinking and making you think, oh well, I must be the crazy one. I'm the one not using common sense if I don't take these gun laws at face value.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's too like an ignorance on our part as citizens just to take, whatever we hear, you know, as gospel, so to speak. And, I can't tell you how many people, like I said, even gun owners that asked them, what does AR stand for? And they're like, assault rifle. I'm like, okay, where did you hear that? And most of the time people would say, oh, on the news. And it's like, okay, well, maybe you should do your research a little bit more, because a lot of these terms are just thrown out there to sound, not to sound pretty, but to sound terrifying. And I think, I hate to say it, but especially the news, they they benefit off fear and inciting fear into the population. And I would say large portions of the government do as well, because it makes us more compliant. And so I think because of that, we have to be very careful about what we believe, because a lot of these people in positions of power that want to make laws, want to make these common sense gun laws, don't know a damn thing about the Second Amendment. They don't know a damn thing about guns in general. If you asked any of them to break down, an AR or a Glock 19, they'd look at you. They'd look at you funny. If you even asked them, what are the three most important rules of gun safety, they wouldn't know what to tell you. And so I think if anything in this country, one of the biggest problems I see anyways is people owning guns but not understanding the responsibility that comes with owning guns, because it's not just it it's not a right that you can just say, oh, it's my right, I can do whatever I want. You still have to use that, with with great gift comes great responsibility. And so so uh so I think that in this case, I mean, it owning a gun and exercising your Second Amendment right comes with a lot of responsibility, and understanding how to take care of your guns, how to utilize proper gun safety, is absolutely critical. And I think the vast majority of the population, including, unfortunately, the vast majority of, I would say a good majority, I won't say the vast majority, because I think there are a lot of responsible gun owners. I think there is a good majority of gun owners that probably couldn't tell you the three most important rules of gun safety, which is never put your finger on the trigger unless you're ready to shoot, never point a gun in the direction of somebody else, right? And so there's, it's I sit and I get frustrated with people sometimes over those things because it's most of the time it's just ignorance, and it's really unfortunate to see. But yeah, I don't have any more on that topic. I think I've kind of exhausted it. Do you guys have anything else to add?
I think I'm just thinking about what you said with um how the media primarily throws these terms around, kind of to give people like these little snippet ideas of what something is.
Mm-hmm.
But in generally, it's not so much that they're trying to educate anybody on what the true thing is, but they just want people to go along with this frame of thought. So it's like it's like they just put a blanket fear over, let's say, guns. So they just think all guns are bad because they told me they were bad, and they do bad things, quote unquote. Somehow they do bad things, but they don't realize that it's the people using the guns that are responsible for what happens. And to just say like, we shouldn't have guns because people are going to be hurt by them. Well, generally speaking, if a person intends to do harm, they can use a variety of different things to do harm with. But if you de-arm everybody else because you're afraid that something may happen if they used a firearm, you're essentially just making a place for violence. Um, my roommate in school actually did a speech on the dangers of having gun-free zones. He said like that's an example of a place that now is a very high place of violence for guns being used by the wrong person. Um, so yeah, I just think it's really good to realize that when you're listening to like little parts of information, especially on the media, just to be wary of that because it may be forming an idea in your mind that's not true, and then you may be making decisions off of a false premise. So,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, off of your point out there on gun-free zones. I mean, prime examples. Don't keep this quick. Look to the city of Chicago. I actually moved from a Chicago suburb not too long ago, and in Chicago, you're not allowed to basically own any firearm unless it's there's like very strict rules. You're allowed to own a handful. It essentially has to be a pump action shotgun with no more capacity, I think, than 4 rounds, or I don't even think you can own a revolver because I think a revolver technically has too high of a capacity yet. So, so I mean, it's insane. But if you look at the city of Chicago and the amount of shootings they have every single day, that's case in point right there on gun-free zones. If an off-duty cop can't even carry his own gun,
mhm.
I mean, and then goes home and gets shot, and this happens all the time. Goes home, gets caught in a shooting, or somebody gets their house broken into, gets shot. I mean, it happens every day in Chicago, and it just because there's a law in place that says you can't own guns doesn't stop the bad people from having guns. So it's it just creates a more dangerous environment for those who are good people that have to live without the ability to protect themselves.
Yeah. And staying on the topic of Chicago, I mean, there's actually been a high correlation since those gun-free gun-free zones were implemented. A high correlation between that and an uptick in violent crimes, as well as the spread of those crimes into places that were once considered relatively safe. For example, Wicker Park, the Lincoln Park areas, nicer areas that are usually populated by young professionals, young families. In addition, even to the downtown area, that's getting dangerous even in occasionally in broad daylight. There have been a couple stabbings this year, actually. One of which was right outside a building I used to work at. So yeah, it just obviously correlation doesn't equal causation, but it is something that is pretty notable that happen to correlate at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you see it across the board. So I think, no matter what, I would say this is the case is outright banning guns is never gonna fix the issue of violence. It's just it won't. It's not gonna fix mass casualties. There'll be other things that happen. They'll just resort to mass stabbings. It happens in Russia and places that guns aren't allowed. London, stabbings happen all the time on the subways. Imagine if you had an armed population in London willing to stop the stabbings. So I think yeah, it seems pretty common sense to me, but I think again it's the fear that gets driven into society that causes this crippling effect that unfortunately causes more devastation in the long run. But a little bit of switching topics here, because I don't want to take too much of our time talking about this. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about a story that I saw, actually a couple headlines this week. One of the big ones I saw was a top Chinese, I didn't see the exact rank of this Chinese official, but I saw it in a news article and it kind of made me sit there and contemplate things for a little bit. But the top Chinese official says that China will continue to strengthen its relationships with Russia and create a, quote, international order intended to challenge Western influence. And so this is something that, you hear it and it sounds a little scary when China and Russia are over there plotting, to topple Western influence. It does sound pretty scary, but it's something that's, been going on for, I think, a while, and we've just kind of turned a blind eye to it. I think a lot of people turn a blind eye to it. But currently, right now, if you're looking at some of the moves that China is making on a global scale, they've partnered with the Saudis. They were in I don't know if it's official yet, but they were talking with the Saudis about essentially switching the main currency used over there for to be the Chinese yen instead of the US dollar, essentially making a large portion of the oil and gas industry then kind of switch over from US currency over to the yen. And the strengthening of the yen has been something that's been happening over the last, I would say probably largely over the past 5 years, but probably even longer than that, 10 years if you even look back, since probably the Obama administration. And one of the biggest things we've seen is a large shift in the roles that Chinese banks are playing on an international scale. There's a lot more international investment, a lot more purchasing of land and corporations in other countries, especially the US. I mean, I believe, I forget what the statistic is, but a large portion of agricultural land in the Midwest, especially in Nebraska, is actually owned by Chinese corporations. Now, these Chinese corporations, it might sound, like, okay, it's a Chinese corporation. It has nothing to do with, the political sphere. But if you know this, you'll know why this is such a big deal. But if you don't, you might not. All Chinese companies are owned at least 51% of all Chinese companies are owned. 51% of the shares are held by the Chinese government, which means essentially that the Chinese government owns every single business. So if you want to go start a business, let's say in China, and you're from the US or a European country, you actually have to let the Chinese government buy into, they essentially have to be like a majority shareholder, I think. And I could be wrong on the majority, but I know for certain that they have to own a very large portion of the company. And what this does is essentially it means that the Chinese government has stakes in all sorts of business across the world. And it means that everything that a Chinese company buys, the Chinese government's really buying it. So you have to be I think this is one of the biggest threats to our national security right now is China, and they're over the years of them buying up, land here, corporation there. I mean, there was I was listening to a podcast with Mike Baker, who is ex-CIA, I believe. And he was on Joe Rogan. He was talking about how a Chinese owned company basically went around and gave I think it happened in Canada first, and then it happened in the US, and they ended up pulling down all these satellite towers, not satellite, cellular towers that were basically given out for free by a Chinese corporation. They're basically handing them out for free to like very large cellular providers. And it became a national security issue because these cellular towers were literally built next to I forget what military base it is out in like the South Dakota area, but it's an area that holds um it might even be a nuclear launch site or something. I could be completely off on that, but like very sensitive government information is there, and it was becoming an issue of national security. And if you look at some of the moves China has made with technology and surveillance, I mean, they're in the business of stealing our data. With TikTok's probably one of the most prime examples of that. I mean, if you download TikTok on your phone, they can literally access a computer that's on the same Wi-Fi network and pull information and data off of that. I mean, it's insane. So I think, reading this headline, it's a little bit concerning that Russia and China are partnering. We'll see, how that plays out. Especially the other headline that I saw, obviously Biden is 60 Minutes address, as I like to call it, his 60 Minutes interview. It was kind of just a puppet show, to be honest with you. But one of the things he said that was extremely concerning was when asked if U.S. forces would go and defend Taiwan in case China invaded. He said, he made it clear that U.S. troops would fight to protect Taiwan if there was an unprecedented attack. I think were his words or something like that, to paraphrase. And then immediately after the White House, a White House official came out and said, they basically wouldn't say if U.S. forces would defend Taiwan. But that interview did not help kind of the tension that's going on between the U.S. and China right now, especially in regards to Taiwan. So it'd be interesting to see too how that plays out. I think that has a lot of implications, not only on a political scale, but a global economic scale as well. I mean, if that war was to ever ensue, or if we were to lose some of our I think if that ever hits, if that shit ever hits the fan, it's time to prepare, your wallets. I think that's one of the things too that makes me more interested in things, and I think we'll talk about this in a later episode, diversifying in investment and not having it all, all your investments hedged into the stock market or the US currency. I think it's important to diversify in alternate forms of investment. And I think that's something, Tom, I know you're the cryptocurrency guru over here. So I think we're going to have to do an episode later down the road on crypto and investments like that, because I think the power that a currency that's independent of a government entity and the power that holds is absolutely incredible. I think also, investing in things like gold and silver that are more tangible, never a bad bet. They've been around since the beginning of time. It's probably going to stick around for a while longer. So if you're, worried about your 401k tanking, it's maybe not, I'm not here to give financial advice, and I'm by no means a financial expert, but I know for myself that I'm looking into investing more into gold and silver as the markets kind of become more volatile. So I think there's a lot kind of hinging on our relationship and the situation in China, the situation in Russia as well. It has a lot of implications for us as citizens, and so I think it's important to stay on top of that. So if you haven't been paying attention to that, maybe it's time to turn on a couple news alerts a week. Maybe don't turn on any news alerts. That's actually a really bad idea. You'll get depressed really quick. But maybe just hop on like once a week and look at some geopolitical stuff and see what's going on in Russia. I mean, that's a nightmare over there right now. See what's going on with China. Actually, if you guys are on Instagram, there's actually a really fantastic news source, and I've been utilizing that. It's called Real News No Bullshit, and I absolutely love them because it's nonpartisan, it's purely news, and they have about, I don't know, six articles that come out a day on various topics. But they're really, I mean, they stay on top of like they have people on the ground. Like I think unfortunately there was a shooting. I want to say it was Texas. I could be completely off on this, and I feel bad that I don't know this, but there was a shooting recently, and they literally had like they had people that work for them or people that they're partnered with literally calling in on the ground there. So they really do stay on top of things. It's very reliable, and so that's Real News No Bullshit. I believe they have a website as well. I follow them on Instagram, so that's if I see, it's really easy because they post a bunch of stories, and I get on once a day and I just scroll through their feed just to see if anything crazy is going on. Actually, what you could do as well is you could just turn on the notification bell for them, and then while you're there, you could turn on the notification bell for the Green Dragon podcast, because then you'll get all the updates for our new podcast releases. And while you're there, you might as well check out our link. It's got it's got our website on there. It's got our links to Spotify, to YouTube. You can listen to the podcast, give us a like, give us a follow. You could subscribe. That always helps. Leave a review if you've listened to the podcast, you like what we're doing. Give us some feedback. Those are always helpful things. So yeah, check us out on Instagram, the Green Dragon Pod. Also on YouTube. But yeah, turn on the notification bell so you get those updates as we post podcasts, give you an update on Instagram, something like that. So, but I think now, I mean, we've spent a bit of time on kind of current news, but I think are you guys ready to jump into maybe the First Amendment stuff?
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah.
Awesome. I know last week you guys read out your handy dandy book to read off the exact words on the Second Amendment. Do you guys want to maybe what we could do is read all the way through? I mean, it's the crazy thing about this First Amendment is I think it's only like 40 words long, but the amount in those 40, like the amount of information in those 40 words is absolutely insane. It's amazing to me. This is what and I was laughing today as I was, reading assault weapon ban bills that are like 500 pages long. But the founding fathers were able to come up with something so eloquent that they were able to express so many different ideas and important things in 40 words. And when you start to unpack this, you realize the significance and the importance like every single word has. And I know I said that I think last week for the Second Amendment, but I mean this one really it was like the first time in a while I'd read through the First Amendment and I was like, holy cow, this is like it's packed. I mean, it's the most beautifully written 40 words I've probably ever read.
Yeah, they were definitely good with the pen.
What you're telling me is they weren't sitting on TikTok all day.
Yeah,
I
their
think
brains went mush.
Yeah, I know. I think that's a lost art, is writing and being able to communicate through the pen. I think it's really cool to go back and read, um, because it was the main form of like media at the time, really, because newsprint, right? It was the best way to share ideas, and so to to see that craftsmanship, the artisan work that you get in a lot of these books, documents, it's incredible.
Yeah, it really is. And like if you read like the Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers, just seeing the level of articulation of thought that they had on each of the discussions and topics they were trying to um, expand upon and understand. And it's really amazing. Like sometimes they could write a full page with one sentence, and you're like, wow.
Yeah, I know. If I tried to do that, my brain might explode, I think.
Yeah,
That's
Federalist and Anti-Federalist was really interesting to me because you can tell, there wasn't any really personal agenda
Mm,
within those writings. It was
yeah,
all both sides were trying to come together to find a solution and find the best form of government that would be the most conducive to long-term prosperity. So another aspect that you don't see very much of nowadays.
yeah,
well
that's
said.
so true. That's so true. Um, Tom or Jake, do you guys want to read? Could just read through it once, and then maybe we could break it down, like kind of point by point. I think there's at least like 5 or 6 solid points that we can kind of read through and dig into a little bit more.
Yeah, do you have it with you, Jake?
I've got it pulled up right here if you guys want me to read it off here.
Yeah.
Sure.
So yes, yeah, start out. It goes, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances.
See, that's it. That's all it is. But it's probably the most powerful, probably one of the most powerful statements that we get from the founding fathers. Um, I guess to kick things off, let's start with maybe that first kind of thought there. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Um, I think the thing that stands out for me, at least, is just the separation of church and state there, um, and recognizing that the government should, you know, really take no part in telling you, me, Sally, Bill, Joe, anybody, right? What they can and can't do in regards to their religion or worship. And I think like the only thing that, maybe wouldn't be included in that is if, you're in like, I don't know, like the church of meth or the church of like killing, or something like that, where it's like completely outrageous, right? But like I think the beautiful thing here, and I think this is kind of the beautiful thing about um America, is we really are like a home for all people, and all people are accepted. And I think that I think the reason why this is so important, especially for the founding fathers, is because you have to remember a lot of them came from a country that really did persecute religion, and so they understood what it meant to be persecuted, um, for practicing their own religion. So I think just keeping that in mind, I think, is why we see I don't want to say aggressive, but such a very clear statement that the government in no way, shape, or form should be involved in how people practice their religion or should limit in any way the practicing of religion.
I agree. Yeah, we did see them, I believe, overstepping the boundaries in that regard during the pandemic, with the closure of churches and when they reopened, having them in a limited capacity. So I think yeah, I think that should definitely trump whatever is going on in the world, the right to exercise religion.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and I think that, obviously when the pandemic started, people were really worried about what it was, right? But at the end of the day, if people want to go to their church and practice their religion, why should the government be involved in stopping that? And yeah, just because just because there's some people going, if you don't want to go to church, practice your religion, that's your own deal, right? I mean, that should be left up to the people to decide, not some governor, not some mayor of a city, right? I mean, that's pretty seems pretty clear to me that that would defy that. So yeah, I think you're totally right there. I think that is a perfect example of a government overstepping its bounds when it comes to um religious practice and the practicing of a religion.
Yeah, something to add on to that, Aiden. Um, I was listening to Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, and he had a large section in there devoted to why the separation of church and state is so important. And he said the main reason is that he said with government, the government's represented by the people, and since the people are changing, the times are changing, and things like that are happening, he said that there's a lot of little laws and little legislation that meets with the different criteria of what's happening in those communities. So if you have a church, let's say, controlling it, then when people are trying to change what's happening in the government, they're indirectly thinking they're rebelling against the church. So he was saying that the reason why Europe lost the faith was because the government was run very poorly. But since the church and the government were so linked, the people thought they had to lose the faith in order to change the government, which was really interesting. I never heard that before, and for him to say that, it made a lot of sense. Um, so I think the founding fathers had a good idea when they said that you need to keep the church and state separate. Um, and it's interesting that they said that there's going to be no law respecting one establishment of religion or an establishment. So that way it leaves it up to the people, their own decision to find the truth in religion. Um, which seems like the best way. I mean, I don't know too much about the philosophy behind that, but from what I can tell, it seems that when people are given the most freedom to find the truth, is usually when they find it the best and the fastest, and it is most conducive for living the faith in the best way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think freedom is 100% necessary to find truth. You can't find truth without freedom. So I think, like you said, I think it's incredibly important that people are given the opportunity to find truth, and they're given the autonomy to do that without any interference. Because if there's interference, then going to be inevitably backlash, and coming from a coming from a Catholic perspective, I know that the Catholic Church, especially recently, has been extremely political, and a lot of it's from from a lot of its leaders, whether it's bishops or cardinals or even the Pope. And I think that's something that firsthand I could see how it's extremely frustrating as somebody that's Catholic to then have to say, okay, well, this is my political belief, but now the church is getting involved in politics and contradicting this. So, what do I stay true to? And that's right there. That's the whole reason why we have the separation of religion and state. And I think there's a pressure nowadays too, especially for religions to become political in their decision making, to kind of conform with the times, whether it's on issues like, you see it across the board, whether it's like, especially I would say probably more so, especially with Islam and Catholicism, I would say on issues like abortion and same-sex marriage and stuff like that. I think you see a lot of pressure from the outside to say, hey, why, you know why are your teachings contradicting kind of the modern thoughts in the modern times on these big issues? And so I think I think I don't think that it should be, I don't think a religion should change just because of a political issue. Those two things need to be completely separate. So yeah, I think that's just the first sentence. So from there it says, so obviously it says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. And then it goes on to say, so this is the second part, or prohibiting free exercise thereof. So kind of going into that, I think it just, at least from my perspective, I think that just kind of goes into what we were talking about a little bit there. As long as the practices aren't like fundamentally immoral, I think it leaves it up to the person to find the truth. And so practicing whatever religion it might be to discover truth for them. It gives the individual, the citizen, the autonomy to do that without interference of the government. From there it says, and this is my favorite, Congress, so kind of going off first, Congress should make no law respecting, or Congress should make no law abridging the freedom of speech. So I think that one, was, the one kind of people remember the most. I love that one. I think that it's pretty straightforward. You should be able to say whatever you want to say, and it could be the most outrageous, horrible thing to say, but the fact that we're given the autonomy, and hopefully, we as human beings know better than to say horrible, outrageous things, but it gives the ability for people to express ideas, express knowledge, express experiences freely without any sort of interference from the government. And I think that's a beautiful thing, because if you look at most countries nowadays, I would even venture to say the US, I don't think there's a free sharing of ideas. You're somehow in some way you're limited to what you can and can't say. And some people might argue, well, you shouldn't say a mean, horrible, it could be a racist thing, it could be a sexist thing. And those things, aren't appropriate things to say. But I think what the founding fathers are saying here is, if we let one thing kind of be the foot in the door for the government to say you can or can't say this, it just opens up the floodgates, right? And so if you let the government say, oh, you can't say that because it's offensive to somebody, then it opens up Pandora's box, right? And I think we're seeing that a lot nowadays, especially with woke ideology and woke culture and what you are and aren't supposed to say. That's offensive to this person. That's offensive to this person. Well, guess what? At some point, everybody's going to be offended. And the whole point of freedom of speech is that guess what? You're going to say some stuff and people are going to get offended. Some people aren't going to like what you say. But some people didn't like what the founding fathers said, like but that's what creates a free expression of ideas and thoughts. Sorry, Tom, I interrupted you.
Exactly right. No, 100%. And to, I think, cement that idea a little more, there's this quote from Benjamin Franklin. He says, "Without freedom of thought, there can be no such thing as wisdom, and no such thing as public liberty without freedom of speech." So, freedom of speech essentially is, I guess you could say, the foundational block upon other liberty, because since we're, as humans, intellectual creatures, we have to understand right from wrong in order to make the right decisions in our lives. And the only way to really do that is to speak and to write down our words and thoughts in order to come to the correct final understanding of something. So I want to touch on what you said with the government like not being an imposition on freedom of speech. I think that's really smart, because if they were to say the things you can and cannot say, you'd probably have like a 1,000,000-page document. You think about all the stuff that could possibly be said or not said, that'd be just insane. So by putting the responsibility on the individual, then the individual has to determine what they say is going to reach certain results in their life. So if you're not a very nice person, you're not going to have friends and no one's going to want to listen to you. So that's the consequence of that happening. So then the person's going to internalize that and like, okay, I should be more polite and courteous to others, which will then mean I'm going to build myself into a better person because I'm engaging in a human activity of speaking with people, sharing ideas, sharing of minds. Yeah, I think it's just so important to realize that fundamental freedom to be able to speak and how important that is, because through that we can come to the truth.
Yeah, I think it's analogous almost to the free market theory, in that the second the government steps in or any other third party steps in and starts regulating the exchange of the general population, it's like, then where do you draw the line? Because you're essentially giving them the autonomy and the authority to regulate whatever they want. There's no stopping at just what is considered mean or offensive or any other inflammatory label they like to put on it. It'll just be extrapolated to the next issue that is convenient for them to demonize.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah, I think both of you guys had really good points there. I think we've seen it especially in the last couple of years. And I think this kind of goes into the next line. So, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. I think that's one we've really seen. I would say probably the last 3 years, especially, I've noticed it. But the influence that government entities have over media sources, whether that's, our traditional television media sources on both sides, whether, you're on the right or the left, you've both got a news source that's extremely, extremely biased, and has a lot, I'm sure has a lot of investment from one branch of the government or the other. I mean, I'm speaking hypothetically here, but I'm almost 100% certain that that's the case. And so you look at that and you wonder how much of the truth you're actually getting. And I think this is one of the biggest infringements on any of the amendments currently in our country and any of our rights currently in this country is the collusion with the press to pump out information that's completely biased and fits a narrative that a certain government entity wants to push. And I think this has been the case, for unfortunately since I don't want to say since the beginning of our country, but for a long time. I mean, in one whether it was newspapers, whether it was a television, station, whatever it might be. Now, social media. I mean, you look at um, what platforms like Instagram, Twitter, Facebook have all done in censoring certain ideas and thoughts coming out there. And granted, there's the argument, well, they're a private entity, but in many cases, the government reaches out to these entities and tells them, hey, listen, there's going to be, and this is like, and this is something I actually guess I didn't realize until I listened to Joe Rogan and Mark Zuckerberg talk. And Mark Zuckerberg's founder of Facebook, right? Facebook Meta, which is now Meta, which is Facebook, Instagram, all the above. And one of the things he said is with I think there was a case with COVID, and there was also a case with the Hunter Biden laptop scenario. The government actually reached out to him and said, "Hey, this story is going to be coming. There's this information coming out. Be on the lookout for false information." They literally said that. So right there, you're interfering with the press. Now, was there probably false information and some like crazy stuff going on? Sure. There's probably a meme out there where Hunter Biden's, doing what, crack. I mean, all sorts of crazy stuff, right? And he was. There's plenty of evidence that he, that whole situation is. We won't go into that. But it's insane to me that it's okay that the government reaches out to an organization that is the primary distributor of information, that being Instagram and Facebook, one of the primary distributors of information, and they can say, "Hey, listen, this might be coming out, whether it's information on COVID, whether it's and this happened, a lot of people, there was a lot of renowned doctors that were actually removed from Facebook and Instagram and Twitter because they were speaking what they thought to be the truth and didn't align perfectly with what the government narrative was or what these social media platforms were getting told by the government was the narrative. That the government was literally going and telling, okay, Facebook, this is the narrative. That maybe not the narrative, but this is what's correct information and this what's incorrect information. And if you see this incorrect information, it's your duty to get rid of it. And I think that is insane. I think that's one of the biggest infringements on our rights today. And so this one gets me really fired up because I know it happens every day. Even if it's a little topic, even if maybe it's not Hunter Biden's laptop, maybe it's not COVID, but it's something. And there's people out there trying to express an idea, and that idea should be left up to us to decide if it's right or if it's wrong. And not the government to say, hey, this idea is right or wrong. Let's pull it down before anybody can see it. That's the censorship. That's censorship of ideas right there. That's how they want us to be, because unfortunately, they have a narrative they want to spin because they want to get reelected. They want to make more money, right? They want all these things. Unfortunately, that's how most politicians work. So if you are able to control the information going to the population, that's the best way to get reelected, right? So I think this one out of all of them is the most relevant nowadays, and I think this is the one where you see the most cases where there's literally infringement on this every single day by our government, and nobody's really doing anything about it.
Yeah, it's good. Yeah, it's a question of like, what do you do with it? That reminds me of something. I don't know if you guys have watched or know of JP Sears. He's the comedian with the long hair.
I love that guy. That guy's great.
He's really funny. To be warned, some of the stuff may be a little bit. You have to have a good sense of humor sometimes.
Definitely.
One of the things he's working on right now is this social media platform called Zion, and it's a social media platform built upon the Bitcoin blockchain network. So it's an uncensorable platform because it's encrypted through the blockchain network. So whatever happens on there stays on there. So it can't be deleted by a central authority. So it's a really interesting idea. I need to learn more about it. But it seems like it's a possible way for a system to keep the government from infringing upon that part of the press or another corporation, like the other ones that have been doing that recently. I don't know when they've been doing it, but yeah.
That sounds amazing, because I think one of the scariest things is, even though like a lot of people argue, social media, these are private companies, and they have their terms and conditions and blah 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 blah. They should be able to pull down whatever goes against their terms and conditions. Well, the problem with that is the primary source of communication now. And I would say this is the biggest argument against it. The primary source of communication now is that is that of social media. So essentially, it's no longer, common speech. It's no longer through newsprint. It's not even it's no longer through TV, right? I mean, like, our ability to communicate with one another, our ability to share ideas is all through social media. And so the press, we should all have autonomy to share an idea and not be censored. And that's our right. So
And it's a right built upon human, like, right, as in, since we're all trying to find the truth, the only way we can find the truth is through freedom of speech. So if we're denied that right, then we're not able to fulfill our roles and fulfilling God's plan for our lives.
yeah, exactly.
Which may be a good segue into the next part, on the right for peaceful assembly.
Yeah, you wanna go ahead and read that, Tom? You wanna lead us into that part?
Sure. So it's to keep away abridging the freedom of speech or the press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble. So this would just be that people can get together, I guess, for whatever. I don't think, since it's pretty open like the other parts. I think it's just the right for people to get together in any form that they choose. Um, and this was actually something you can see with the COVID protocols on how unconstitutional those were, to deny people the right to get together in any form, and then for them to be policed if they went against those quote unquote guidelines. Um, that was a really, really bad infringement. And it wasn't and cannot be constitutionally held. Um, so I think that's a really good example of recent history on how bad things get if people cannot come together on their own choosing.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think and to kind of, show you the other, what happens when that doesn't happen. When you're not allowed to have that right is Jake, I think I sent this to you, but I saw a video and this was absolutely insane. It was from somebody in China took a video of they're deploying drones now into the streets of China, telling people to stay inside their homes. So they're literally, flying drones through the streets, flying them through giant apartment, these sky rises, and saying they basically have them hooked up to like a audio, like the speakers, and they're saying, please stay inside. Thank you for your compliance. And essentially, if you leave your house when the government tells you you can't leave your house, you get jailed. And in China, who knows what else? You probably get, thrown in a concentration camp or something. So I think that's the other that's the other side of the coin. When you give the government the ability to tell you when you can and can't go out, assemble, when you can and can't go outside, when you can and can't meet with other people, it it gives them, I mean, it literally gives them control over your life. And the other thing it does is, and I think this is something that goes back into the freedom of speech and the sharing of ideas. When you tell people, when you take away people's ability to meet with each other, and this is something I think we saw in COVID, you take away this, I think it's a sense of camaraderie, but you also take away the ability for people to share ideas with each other. And I think that's something that's extremely devastating to the human person. I think that it deteriorates our psyche. I think we saw that with a lot of the riots that happened. I think we saw it with a lot of the looting that went on. I mean, like people came out of COVID lockdowns like animals, like absolute animals. And I think one of the reasons is because of the lack of human contact, the lack of ability to sit down with somebody and talk to somebody in person, that physical connection, and the ability to just to get stuff out, share ideas with people. And when the government starts to limit the sharing of ideas between people, whether it's through social media or in-person meeting, it really it creates a situation where the government's controlling all the information, the inflow and outflow of information. So I think, this is just as important as free speech. Our ability to meet with each other, to get together. And I mean, this is why we started this podcast, guys, is because we were inspired by the Green Dragon Tavern, the place where the founding fathers met together to literally start the revolution, to share ideas with each other, share ideas about this idea of America, the United States of America, right? And so when you take that away, you literally rip the guts out of what it means to be a human person. And so I think that's why this is so important, is because without the ability to assemble, we as people are essentially nothing. There's no community, there's nothing there.
Yeah. And that was you touched upon the fact that without assembling your community, there's no ability to converse at all and bring up ideas. And like a historical example of that would be the Soviet Union in throughout the whole 20th century, at least the latter part of it. They actively encourage acquaintances to inform upon each other, or even children to inform upon their parents. Any activity that was running contrary to the party line, and that set the stage for just this mass fear of each other among the population, and it deteriorated any meaningful conversation that would go on, and that's really what opened the door for them to commit the mass genocide that they did. Is that the people just weren't no one was on the same page with each other, no one could openly discuss what they thought was right or wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually have a kind of a firsthand experience of that in kind of a more modern context. And I'm going to try to, protect some people here because I don't want to get anybody in trouble over this. But when I was in college, I took a trip to China. And the people I met with in China were absolutely fantastic people. Never met more kind, genuine people in my life. One of the biggest takeaways I had from visiting China was the fear that people live in when sharing their own ideas and their own thoughts that are separate from, you know, the ideas that are perpetrated by the Chinese Communist Party. So there's no autonomy there. And one of the stories I had was a story of this girl that I spoke with, and she told me, you don't speak out against the government, you know, you fall in line. She says, because if you speak out against the government, you'll disappear. And she told a story about her uncle and her uncle's family, who her uncle spoke out against the Chinese Communist Party. And take this into mind. This is when I was there, I was 2019. So 2019, and she's telling me the story about her uncle who spoke out against the Chinese Communist Party. Said some things that were contrary to the agenda that they have, right? Well, he disappeared along with his family. And since then, she and her family have not heard from him and his family since. So it's not just people will say, oh, well, that's an issue of the past. But it's not. I mean, you're talking about the largest country on the planet, the most powerful right now, the most powerful country on the planet. And it's a firsthand example of what happens when you take away freedom of speech. What happens when you take away the right to for people to peaceably assemble, to meet, to share ideas. Everything's controlled by the government, and it leads to pure tyranny. So I think now more than ever, it's imperative that we as Americans preserve this amazing gift that we have, because really, we're one of the most fortunate. We live in one of the most fortunate places to live when it comes to the sharing of ideas and free speech. Still, even though there's been a lot of infringement upon that, we're still in a country that billions of people in China envy because they have absolutely no autonomy. So I think that's something that I think every single one of us takes for granted. That we have the ability to sit here and talk about this, where if we were in China right now posting this podcast, there would be no doubt in my mind that the police would show up tomorrow to our tours, at the very least take all our podcasting equipment and at the worst, we'd never be seen again. So I think that's something just to keep in mind, that we as Americans have so many gifts, and if we don't protect them, if we don't hold on to them, if we don't realize how well lucky we are, we'll lose it.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for sharing that, Aiden. That put a lot of perspective in my mind. Just on
Yeah,
how, yeah.
yeah. When I heard that, I was like, "Oh my gosh!" Like, you know, it makes you really sit there and think about, wow, like what have I taken for granted?
And that reminds me too of like how, especially it seems like in the social media realm with young people, they all are hype jumping onto that bandwagon of like saying that Americans are oppressive and like we're a bad place to be and all this stuff. It's like, well, wait a minute, like you're sitting here and being able to share that thought. You couldn't do that in one of those countries that you're like China or something. So first off, you should be grateful for having that place to be here to be able to say that. And second of all, they all want that freedom themselves. And so you shouldn't poo poo America for the really good thing that we have here. That isn't right on them to do that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, we saw it in Hong Kong, right? There was the riots and the protests against the government, and this is, goes back to the right of the people to peacefully assemble. Those people were shut down. All government news sources denied that these riots were going on, and the people were basically locked up just because they were fighting for their democracy. Um, so I think, yeah, like you said, Tom, you're absolutely right. I think most people in this world, have half the rights that we do here in America, if that, so we have a lot to be grateful for, and this country could really benefit for a bit of gratitude and a lot less whining. That's my 2 cents on it. I think that, the people that talk about privilege are sometimes don't realize how privileged they are. We're all privileged here in this country for the rights that we have. We have to realize and then have the gratitude to realize what we have and be grateful for what we have, and it's not all of us, and I can totally acknowledge not all of us are on the same playing field. Obviously there's some people that start out in lesser circumstances than maybe I started out in, but at least we live in a country where there is opportunity to, you know, to become something great, to be able to share your thoughts and ideas with others. And yeah, I think there's a lot. I think if half this country decided tomorrow that they were going to have an attitude of gratitude, I think it'd be a lot better.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I'm sure you guys know the stat about how the average poor person in America has a cell phone, an Xbox, and cable TV. So that does really put things in perspective when you compare that against China, some of the African countries and other places where people are experiencing actual repression.
No,
True.
yeah, it's true.
Yeah.
So I think we can move into our last part of the First Amendment, which is the final like kind of clause here, or thought, and it says, "And to petition the government for a redress of grievances." Um, I think what comes to mind for me is it kind of goes back to I think it comes back to our ability to hold the government. I think it comes back to this idea that the government isn't here to tell us what we can and can't do. The government is here to serve us. And so if we have a problem with them, they work for us. And that's something to remember. They work for us, and if we have a problem with it, it's our duty as citizens and as employers of the government, and I'll say it, employers of the government, because that's what we are. We pay taxes. If I'm going to pay taxes, guess what? I'm going to get what I want. I'm going to be selfish. I'm going to tell the government what I want, right? And that's their job. It's their job to serve us and to serve America, not for us to serve them and serve their intentions and put money into their wallets, which is what it's become. But I think that this final statement of this First Amendment is reminding us that the government is here to serve us, and if we have a problem with them, if we have an issue with anything that they've done, we need to make them aware of it, and it's time to it's a money back guarantee is what I like to think of it as. And if they're not doing their job, guess what? They better pony up and start forking out the cash out of the wallet. Or at the very least fire somebody, right? So I think for me at least, it's a reminder that we have to be vocal as Americans. We have to tell our government, you know, what we want, right? And if we let them run all over us, that's our own fault. It's our rights are stated right here.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well
I
said.
agree. And it goes without saying that the world would be a much better place if more people had that attitude towards the government.
Yep. I'm a firm believer that the government is to put it in not so nice words, the government's my bitch. I'm not the government's bitch. That's the way I look at it, right? So I'm not gonna let a bunch of politicians in Washington tell me how to live my life. I'll tell them how they're supposed to do their job. So yeah, I think that's a great way to end to end today's podcast. I think it's I think the First Amendment was, in my opinion, the most beautifully and eloquently written 40 words that I've ever read in my life. And I think there's a lot of really important truths that it holds. And I think, we as Americans need to recognize that we have a lot to be grateful for, and we have a lot that we can't and shouldn't take for granted. And if we want to continue to be able to say what we want, be able to, practice the religion we want, to be able to, do what we want, right? Really, I mean, meet together to share ideas, to make sure that the government knows that they're not, in charge of us. We're in charge of them. I think that's what we as Americans need to realize. That's what the founding fathers. That's why the founding fathers wrote this. They didn't just write it for fun. They didn't write it to sound pretty, right? They wrote it for a purpose, and that's the purpose right there. So I think that's something that I'll take into this week. And I hope everybody else takes into this week. So you guys have any final thoughts?
I think that was good. Yeah, I think I'm gonna definitely think about this and throughout the week and just see the implications of what it means. And then I think also imagine like what the world would be, especially in America, if this amendment was upheld.
Mm, yeah.
Yeah. Be a great place. That's what I can imagine.
I couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more. Well, everyone, thanks for joining us tonight. I hope that you learned something tonight, and I hope you take something into your next week. It's something to think about, especially how lucky we are as Americans to have what we have, to be given these wonderful documents which support our rights and our freedoms. So, going into this week, be safe, be a good person, but most importantly, remember to be a good American. Thanks for joining us.